As a way to introduce Greg to you, I thought I'd read a few lines from his bio, from his book. In early 2003, Greg Mitchell was one of the few mainstream journalists to seriously question the stated reasons for invading Iraq. In the years since, he has repeatedly challenged the media to probe the conduct of the war and its toll on our troops. Now, after 5 years of war, he traces the conflict from the run-up to the surge and the media's coverage of it in this important collection of commentaries. If a free press is the watchdog of democracy, then Greg Mitchell must be the watchdog of the watchdogs, tracking the performance of the media at editor and publisher, the influential magazine of the newspaper industry. Over the past 5 years, in his widely read column, Pressing Issues, he has repeatedly been ahead of the curve in intensely scrutinizing both the president and the press. His book is a unique history of the entire war and as topical as today's headlines. That said, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on a beautiful night. I'm sure you can all think of 2 or 3 other things you might also be doing tonight, but thank you for coming. And it's also good that we can, after last night, we probably can talk about things other than Reverend Wright and lapel pins and bowling, and maybe get back to the war. You remember the war. Used to be in the news a few weeks ago, but maybe it'll be back. It's also good timing to be here now because we have just seen recently a number of commemorations. We had the 5th anniversary of the start of the war, the 5th anniversary of the fall of Baghdad. We had the 4,000th U.S. military fatality. Of course, there's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who have also died. And then we had last week Mission Accomplished, the 5th anniversary of Mission Accomplished, which everyone had some fun with, you might say. But maybe on a little lesser level, we also had the 2nd anniversary of another epic event, which was the 2nd anniversary of Stephen Colbert's classic routine at the White House Correspondents' Dinner 2 years ago in Washington, which I'm proud to say at my other job as editor and publisher, I was the first person to write about it just minutes after it concluded and got it up on our website where it was linked by many other places and got millions of page views for various people. Now what's forgotten about that routine is the people who do remember it remember that he was mocking the president who was sitting just 10 yards away. But what's forgotten is he also almost equally went after the media. He said, for example, that he was against the liberal media in the room, everyone but Fox News, which is fair and balanced and gives both sides of every story, the vice president's side and the president's side. And he also said, he actually had a long quote, which is right in the introduction. It's one of the first things in my book. And there's a whole chapter in my book on his talk. And in it, he laid out, he said he sort of was reminiscing to the days when the press, during the run-up to the war, pretty much repeated everything the president was putting out. And he advised the reporters to go back to those days and reminisce about those times and maybe go home and, as he said, work on that novel you've always wanted to write. You know, the one about the courageous Washington reporter who stands up to the president, fiction. And it was a little wonder that in the days afterwards, most of the reporters kind of panned his routine. They seemed to think the thing with the Bush and his impersonator was much funnier. And the reason was because he was hitting pretty close to home there. And also very telling was that few of the reporters were really laughing while the thing was going on. So I use that in my book because it is illustrative of the mainstream media's lack of reflection on some of their shortcomings. Now, I mean, there are other lighter moments in the book, but it is a serious book in the main. And it really is the first 5-year history of the war. When you think about it, there's been dozens or hundreds of books, and almost all of them, well, really all of them, are really on parts of the war. Maybe on the run-up to the war, maybe on how Rumsfeld screwed up, or how the occupation was screwed up, and so forth. So there's been a lot of books, a lot of soldier stories, but there really has not been a real history of the whole war. And this book really, I didn't really set out to do it. It just kind of happened. It traces the media response to the war, or to the war fever, from the run-up to the war right up till last November, after the first Petraeus report to Congress, as differentiated from the second Petraeus report, which was much like the first one. And both times he gave himself an A. So I'm sure some of you people would like to grade your own papers in your classes. But in any case, the book does go from the run-up to the surge, to really the reaction to the surge last fall. So it really is 5 years of the war, but it's through the prism of the media criticism, what I was reporting as I went along, about how the media was handling the war. And I fill in, as we go along, the chronology. It's a month-by-month chronology of what was going on in the war and other things in the media. So it really does give a pretty full picture. Now, what I'll do is I'll talk for a short while here and leave it open for questions. I'm going to hit on a lot of topics, maybe in brief fashion, and probably somewhat chronological now that I've given an overview. So I'll kind of start with a little bit on the run-up. But as I said, most of the book is not really about the run-up. It's really, 90% of it is what's happened since the fall of Baghdad. And then you can ask questions on any of the many subjects we touch on. So let's start with in the run-up. Now, at editor and publisher, which is, going to my bio a little more, I've written 8 other books. My career has been split between being editors of magazines and freelancing and writing books. I've written several other books about politics and history. I've co-authored 2 books by Robert J. Lifton, who now lives in Cambridge, and I just talked to him this afternoon. We did 1 book on Hiroshima, how the U.S. reacted to Hiroshima after the bombing. And we did another book on capital punishment in America today. And I've written numerous other books. So that's a little bit of my background. But editor and publisher, which I started editing about 6 years ago, is sort of the Bible of the newspaper industry for 125 years. And it's never been really a political magazine, but since I took over, which coincided pretty much with the run-up to the war, we have had a very popular website, has been quite influential in a lot of our media coverage related to the war and so forth. So when in the run-up to the war, we were among the few, what I would call mainstream publications, to repeatedly raise questions about the arguments for war and about how the media was responding to the arguments. And we did that repeatedly for months in the run-up to the war. And it's not to say other questions were not being raised, even by the mainstream, but it was very scattershot. We saw the New York Times, for example, had many horrendous articles. I don't have to detail them here, with Judith Miller and Michael Gordon and some other people, which turned out to be quite bogus, based on terrible sources and so forth. But they also did have some good stories, maybe back on page 22, where some of the bogus stories were on page 1. And the Washington Post was much the same. They don't seem to get as much notoriety as the Times, but the Washington Post was much the same thing. Mainly, the more critical stories were pushed back, and the scare stories were up front. So, but at EMP, we were continually raising questions. So I go back in the book, you'll find my interview with Daniel Ellsberg in 3 months before the war, where he raised very prescient questions. You're saying the government was lying us into the war. They had lied us into the war in Vietnam. They're lying just as much now. And he said, and you can't lie more than that, which I thought was a great line. we talked to Chris Hedges, who is a former New York Times war reporter, and he said he wouldn't cover this war because really the war was really, the Pentagon had unveiled the embed program, which was, as you probably know, was reporters and photographers signing up on the dotted line to cover the war with the protection of the military, traveling with the troops, subject to censorship, and he just said he just didn't believe in that. He says it'd be okay in a limited fashion, but you needed reporters like him, crazy people like him who would go out and actually go out and try to get the real story on their own. So we did a number of stories about the embed process, and we quoted, we did 3 separate interviews with Chris Hedges, again warning if you read them in the book, completely prescient on what was going to happen, in the occupation. And he sort of said something like, "Congratulations, when we win, it's going to be like Gaza, and the U.S. is going to become like Israel." And so there's a lot of that. We also noted the reaction to Colin Powell's famous presentation to the United Nations. Again, there's many embarrassing, almost humorous, they're so embarrassing quotes from Washington Post, New York Times, and other people about how Powell had made his case. It was a slam dunk. A famous quote by Richard Cohen of the Washington Post that only a Frenchman would disagree with Powell's proof. Again, it's all there for your entertainment if you want to go back. But of course, it's tragic. You can almost poke fun at it, but it is the tragic results. And one of the most blatant, if the press is still around and the U.S. is still around 200 years from now, this will be in the textbooks. They'll be having quotes from editorials and columnists responding to Colin Powell's slam dunk evidence before the UN. And then, we also raised questions about one of the great myths that you still hear today is that Saddam had kicked the inspectors out. There were no inspectors. We had to go in because the inspectors weren't allowed, and so forth. And of course, in reality, UN inspectors were on the ground there for a couple months, and were finding absolutely nothing. And again, the press was poking fun at them and saying they weren't looking hard enough, or they were in league with Saddam, and so forth. And that surely, when we get in there, we're going to find all these WMDs. In fact, our friend Judy Miller of the New York Times even got a special security clearance so she could go in with the military and help them find the WMDs, which, again, turned out to be bogus. And again, the tragic, almost humorous, but mainly tragic element to that, the missing WMDs, and the myth today that there were no inspectors in Iraq. They only left because the president's 48-hour deadline was approaching, and so they got out. And then finally, there's a recurring theme in the book. Well, it's not a theme, but repeatedly, and I throw this out for you to ponder what you think the reason is or was, is the polls, all sorts of credible polls, major polls showing when we went to war, that the majority, more than 50% of the people, believed that there were Iraqi hijackers on planes that struck us on 9/11. Better than 50% believed that there had been proven that Saddam was was in on 9/11. And then the same polls later showed that the majority of people felt that we actually had found WMDs. After the war. This is bad enough when you consider these were the findings when we went to war. This is what people knew or thought they knew. Now, whether this is because this is the media's fault, whether it's American people's lack of interest, paying attention, whether it's just a signal of the growing partisanship today, where people on the left and the right mainly get their news and opinion from one source, and not a cross-section of views, or whatever. You know, you can ponder that if you wish. But polls, as I show in the book, every few chapters, polls continued for until recently, showing that large numbers, 40%, 38%, 33%, very large number of people, 50 million, 100 million people, if you will, still believe that there were Iraqi hijackers on the 9/11 planes, still believe that Saddam had been linked to 9/11, and still believe we found WMD in Iraq. So I don't know how much the media contributed to that. I would say that they, obviously did not push the truth strongly enough, but how much individual Americans should be blamed for that, I'm not sure. But that's another continuing theme in the book. And then finally, after we did go into the war, as you know, where Baghdad fell, and then we had mission accomplished. Again, at EMP and in the book and in my columns and blogs ever since. I've returned to mission accomplished and the coverage, and Chris Matthews admiring Bush's flight suit and saying we're all neocons now, and different people saying women love a hero and George Bush is macho, and women love Bush and they love all this stuff, and Brian Williams, all sorts of people, not just the wackos, admiring the Bush landing on the aircraft carrier and the war is over and so forth. We know what's happened since. So that's my thoughts on sort of the run-up and the victory of the war, and the way it's tried to cover it in the book, tried to cover it at the time, and I've tried to cover it, recently in columns and blog postings. I blog every day at Huffington Post and some other places. And so that's where we were. Now, again, the book then takes off from there, and 3/4 of the book or more then covers the last 5 years since mission accomplished. And there are, again, various themes that reoccur. Again, any questions you want to ask when we're done, which, I'll only talk for another 10 minutes or so, and we can have plenty of time for discussion if you want. One continuing theme has to do with the visual aspect, not just the words, and the maybe partly censorship, partly self-censorship, the lack in the American press showing the real graphic images of the war, really up to the present day. Some of you may be aware of the recent bombings in Sadr City. One particular boy was killed. Photos of him being taken out of the rubble was shown all over the world. Americans could see it on websites, but it wasn't on the front page of the New York Times. But it became a famous photo and rallying cry around the world. But this has been true from the beginning, including the, I'm sure you're aware of the controversy over the lack of allowing photos of returning coffins from Iraq. I almost said Vietnam. From Iraq. That controversy, again, up to the present day, we had the case just 2 weeks ago where a family gave the media, I think of the Washington Post, express permission to film her son's funeral, which was at Arlington, I believe. And even there, the military kept the media out, even though the family had expressly given permission. And again, you stop and think about it, how many really graphic photos have you seen showing American dead or American wounded on the battlefield? There's been very little that Americans have really seen. Amazingly, all these years after Vietnam, we actually probably saw more from Vietnam than we've seen of this war in the mainstream media. Now, of course, we all have access to the web. There's plenty of ways to see this stuff. You can't say Americans have not been exposed to it, at least a lot of Americans, maybe like yourself. But vast majority of Americans really have had no clue of the carnage over there, and both the Iraqi civilians and the Americans. They read the statistics about the enormous number of American soldiers who have brain damage or who are suffering from post-traumatic stress. Reportedly 300,000 of them have some sort of mental issues. Huge numbers in the hospitals having lost limbs and so forth. But you say, well, how did they get there? When did that happen? So there's a good deal in the book about the visual side of it. There's also a continuing theme on which, and the book actually only has a smattering, but in real life, about every 3 months, I wrote a column about trying to urge or egg on at least one major newspaper to come out for a change of course in Iraq. Not necessarily an immediate pullout, but going back 4.5 years ago, calling for at least one major or semi-major newspaper to call for a change in course, maybe benchmarks or timetable or something, beginning a phased withdrawal, something all that radical. And never happened. So about every 3 months I'd write another column. I'd get some angry letters from editors saying, how dare you tell us what to do, and all that kind of stuff. It really didn't happen until about a year or so ago. The Los Angeles Times reversed course and came out with such an editorial. And in the so-called liberal New York Times did not do it till last summer, not even a year ago. The New York Times finally ran an editorial saying we need to reverse course and start to pull out, or it'd be nice if we could start to pull out or have a timetable or some such. So that is a continuing theme in the book, the lack of editorials and pundits really calling for a change in direction. Now, it's often people confuse the fact that probably most newspapers and pundits have been critical of the operation of the war. Some of them called for Rumsfeld's firing fairly early on. So newspapers have been, like certain congressmen and a lot of other people, have not been afraid to be critical of the operation of the war, but they always stopped short when it came to what do we do about it. And of course, most famously, Tom Friedman of the New York Times. Some of you may be aware of have heard of the Friedman Unit, which even has an entry on Wikipedia. The Friedman Unit equals 6 months, and it is in tribute to Thomas Friedman. Again, there's a chapter in my book that has many of his quotes, where every 6 months he would say, we just need another 6 months. The government's going to turn it around in 6 months, or if things don't improve there, I'm going to withdraw my support in 6 months. And when you read the quotes, it's really not an exaggeration. Sometimes he said 9 months. But, and so someone a couple years ago created the Friedman Unit, and it represents 6 months. So if you, sometime someone says when you're going to graduate or something, if it's 2 years from now, you could say 4 Friedman Units. Or, I can't wait till, the Olympics, or I can't wait till this year's elections, which are coming in 1 Friedman Unit. So you can have some fun with it if you want. But in reality, I think, poor Tom Friedman has been picked on a little too much, perhaps, because he actually was quite typical of pundits, very typical. And he made the mistake of continually putting months, numbers, so he was easy to lampoon. But in reality, 95% or 85% of all pundits have said much the same thing. So that's a continuing theme. Sort of a sub-theme, and again, you can ponder this. More than 5 years ago, I may have been the first mainstream journalist to make references, compare Iraq to Vietnam, and use the dreaded word quagmire. I did it first when there was a picture in the New York Times, again, more than 5 years ago, a huge picture which showed Bush had called together a meeting of former Pentagon chiefs at the White House. And there was this priceless photo of Rumsfeld shaking hands with Robert McNamara, the Vietnam Pentagon chief. And so my caption was McNamara saying to Rumsfeld, what part of Vietnam don't you understand? And a lot of people, again, made fun of me. How could you call it? I mean, I didn't say it already was a quagmire. I said it would become one. And started making comparisons to Vietnam, and they'd say, well, how could you say that? You know, one's a desert and one's a jungle, or, you know, they have different food. You know, there's no lemongrass in Iraq, you know. But of course, the point was that once you get into a place, you start losing American boys, you spend all this money, you put all this prestige on the line. The longer you stay, the longer you have to stay. And of course, that's exactly what's happened, tragically. I wish I had been proven wrong. But once you get apart from some of the specifics and the overall death toll, there really are a lot of comparisons as we go into as we're into our sixth year in Iraq to the mindset or the you know, what happened in Vietnam. The same sort of problems getting out is what the comparison is. Another continuing theme in the book that I'm sort of particularly proud about is very early on, again, I think the first column that's in the book is from July or June 2003, focusing on the veterans, or the soldiers and the veterans, the toll on them. Early on, we weren't even counting the deaths that weren't in combat. At that time, I think a majority of the deaths were in accidents, vehicle accidents, things like, you know, insurgents in a truck with a bomb in it were driving towards a convoy, and the convoy went in the ditch, and, you know, 4 people died, and they weren't counted as in the official death toll. It was just a roadside accident. And so I did a couple of hard-hitting columns on that, and within a few days, all of the major newspapers changed the way they counted. So I like to think I had something to do with that. And also, very early on, I may have been the first person to focus on the kind of shockingly high number of suicides among servicemen in Iraq. Again, not hardly reported by the mainstream press or by anyone. Almost impossible to get numbers on it or confirmation. And I've continued this for you know, almost 5 years, as recently as you know, 2 days ago. And the way I do it is I search through Google, and invariably every couple of weeks there's a suicide. Sometimes they're veterans of the war, not people over there, and a local paper will cover it. A local newspaper, because they hear from the family, or these deaths are counted as non-hostile. The Pentagon announces them. They say they're death by non-combat or non-hostile, and they're being investigated. That's all the information you get, all the information you'll ever get. It's being investigated. And but often the local newspapers will find out what really happened, and they'll report it, and then I may write about it. We had a case I wrote about just a couple days ago. It was reported in a small Alabama paper about a woman who had found out, about a woman whose son had killed himself before her eyes recently, a veteran, and she was now leading her own crusade to help other veterans get treatment. He had been diagnosed with post-traumatic shock and hadn't gotten the right treatment and so forth. This is going on every day around the country. And until the last few months, got very little attention in the media. We see more now, again, bringing it up to the present day. Virtually everything I've talked about so far and in the book has a modern day, it's still going, whatever I'm talking about is still going on. So the book is actually quite timely. We had the case, I wrote about it as recently as this morning. If you haven't heard about this, the head mental health director of the Veterans Administration wrote a now famous email. CBS last fall did the first major probe of veteran suicides from Iraq and Afghanistan. And this director of VA mental health thing sent an email that had the classic subject line, shh. And then in the email, basically told the subordinates not to cooperate with CBS, to mislead them, to not give them the information. And the fact that they knew the VA had been putting out misinformation about this, and even in the email he admitted that exactly what CBS was charging was true, that there were 1,000 attempts a month among veterans, 1,000 suicide attempts a month, while the VA was claiming 50 or something like that. CBS had the number, and this guy was saying shh. So, of course, people have called for his be fired, and the head of the VA just yesterday testified that he wouldn't fire him because, as he said, everyone makes a mistake. Use bad choice of words, as he said. Everyone's written an embarrassing email, and this guy just had a bad choice of words. So there you go. So, I mean, this is a continuing thing. The media has paid more attention to the suicides, and again, a story that I covered that happened just after the time frame of the book last fall was a soldier was electrocuted in Iraq, and the mother was told that he had gone into the shower with an electric appliance. You know, stupid guy. Well, then it turned out that wasn't true at all, and that it was due to faulty wiring, and that KBR was involved, and and started a whole scandal. Now there's a big investigation. There have been at least 12 electrocutions. I helped the mother find out the other cases. She now has a lawsuit going, et cetera, et cetera. So this is happening all the time. This is happening all the time to the actual soldiers who are over there, and the veterans when they come home. So, again, I have a number of chapters about suicides ranging from Colonel Ted Westhusing, the highest ranking member in the military, who shot himself in the head after complaining about abuses and cover-up of contractor, and gee, he seemed to mention General Petraeus in his suicide note. Isn't that interesting? Another suicide that I wrote about that got a good amount of attention was Alyssa Peterson, who was an interpreter, a Mormon, a young woman sent to Iraq, who was, became involved in interpreting, if that's the word, at interrogation of insurgents, and objected to the techniques, torture or quasi-torture or whatever it was, and was so disturbed by it, she asked to be relieved of that duty, and then a short while later shot herself to death again. And we have, again, case after case of that. She's become something of a heroine to some people. So again, these are recurring themes in the book because they're recurring themes in the war. And the book tells the story of the whole war by the media's lack of coverage, poor coverage in some areas, lack of coverage in others. Now, I should say before I go any further, the book also, and in my other writings, has a good deal about some of the terrific reporting. Many of the brave reporters, mainstream reporters, who have gone to Iraq, stayed in Iraq for years, risked their lives, and have written some terrific stories. There's been a lot of terrific journalism done there. Some of it, more recently, they've had to rely on Iraqi stringers, and the Iraqi stringers are getting blown up and killed at checkpoints and so on and so forth, because it's too dangerous to get out. But many of the U.S. reporters, and again, some of them have not done such a good job. There's a lot of stories that haven't been told. But I do want to tip my hat, as I do in the book, to much of the coverage that has come out of Iraq by certain people, and there's been some good coverage back in the U.S. as well. So you don't want to have a blanket condemnation of everybody's work, especially when some people really risk their lives. Unfortunately, one of the stories, because of the difficulties and the violence there, that has gotten too little attention, and again, I have a couple chapters in it in the book, has to do with Iraqi civilian casualties. the huge number. People disagree on the number, but a shockingly high number. And the payment, the condolence payments, as it's known, where the U.S. recognizes when maybe someone has died due to their own trigger-happy nature or just by accident, you know, they didn't mean it, but an Iraqi, often a child, has been killed or badly injured, and they make payments of $500 or $2,000 or whatever. So there's, and I quote at length from reports of these incidents that I believe the ACLU got out, were able to get released some specific reports. So you'll read some of these reports and you'll get a much better sense of what goes on there. Just humdrum day to day, someone walking down the street, you know, carrying a rug, and they think he's got a gun, and, you know, and they shoot him. He turns out he's a rug merchant taking a rug home, you know. Oh, give the family $1,500, you know. Or cases like that, and then the conclusion is, you know, the conclusion in the file is no payment necessary or payment denied or whatever. This whole issue of civilian casualties in Iraq, you know, again, apart from the Haditha massacre, I think there's a new movie. I saw a review in the Times today about Haditha. Some of the so-called massacres have gotten a fair amount of attention. And of course, it's tragic, but every day, or well, every week, certainly there are large numbers of civilians who are being killed there. And that hasn't gotten nearly the attention it deserves. So that takes us up to more recent times. I'll take a deep breath here in the home stretch. And I just want to get into just developments from the past year very briefly. And again, in 5 minutes, we can go to questions. First thing I would say is probably the biggest press failing since the run-up to the war occurred, well, really a year and a half ago in another run-up, and this was the run-up to the surge. You know, it became very clear, again, I'm not 100% sure of the day, around November, a year ago November, when, you know, if you remember, the Iraq Study Group came out with their report, which people thought was going to be a life raft for Bush, that it urged more negotiations, it urged, you know, benchmarks and timetables and being willing to start withdrawing and so forth, and that Bush would hold on to this for dear life as a bipartisan solution. And, you know, almost from day one, he said, well, I don't know, I've got my own idea. You know, well, it's good idea, but I'm working on my own plan. You know, bing, I don't know, the alarm bells went off for me, but yet the media once again went sleepwalking into the abyss. And week after week passed, Bush even announced, oh, I'm going to announce my plan, January 7th or whatever the date was. Press, you know, enjoyed their Christmas holiday and so forth. And I did a column, which I think is in the book, around January 1st, which pointed out that not a single major newspaper, and by major I mean top 30, had written a single editorial about the surge, about the coming report. Not even a pro or con. I mean, they couldn't even work up the enthusiasm to say, gee, we hope Bush stays in Iraq forever, or we hope he pulls out. There's nothing. And here's this flashing light, you know. Bush is going to announce, and you know, people in the know were saying he's probably going to announce an escalation. He's probably going to want to send more troops. He's got this plan to try to do it right this time. And there was nothing. And then finally, a few days before, maybe 2 or 3 days, there were a couple columns, there were a couple editorials. Some people said, well, it'll be interesting to see what he says. We hope he makes a good argument. We don't know, we're a little nervous, you know. And the New York Times did the same thing. And then the day after, or 2 days after the speech, then a lot of people weighed in. Oh, I don't know, is this a good idea? You know, well, maybe it's a good idea. He didn't explain it very well. We have questions and so forth. So essentially, he got a free ride again for this escalation, which, as predicted, by some, went on. It was not a surge. It became a permanent escalation. It's now a year and a half later. We have more troops in Iraq than we had then. And yet the press, first of all, didn't raise questions about it beforehand. And then when it started, it was, well, we'll see where we're at in 6 months. It's probably going to be over. We'll send these troops there. They'll come home, and you know, Bush will have his little 6-month surge. And of course, it's become 18 months and counting. So that kind of bugs me a little. Also, this year we have a downturn in coverage overall, lack of coverage, absence of coverage. I was on Jim Lehrer program a couple months ago with reporters who were all sort of saying, well, we have our budgets cut and we're covering the campaign and the mortgage crisis and so forth, which are all true. But at the same time, they weren't even picking up like they could have picked up AP stories and put them on the front page. That didn't cost anything. So there was a real drop-off in coverage, and then people would, and then they'd say, well, you know, polls show the public is not as interested. Well, of course, the public thought, judging from the press, that the war might be over, or was practically over, or the surge had carried the day. So imagine their surprise a couple months ago when suddenly we had violence picking up again, and we set a recent record last month for U.S. deaths. In Iraq, violence has peaked. You know, Basra was aflame, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Judging from the media, we had things well in hand there. And then, of course, the media says the public isn't that interested, and then the public says, well, the media doesn't seem that interested. So, vicious circle there. And that's continuing today. It's still, you know, we haven't seen a big upsurge in coverage. We did around mission accomplished and so forth. But again, a major point that I'd make, current to today, at the 5th anniversary, you may recall, you may be aware that when you think back to all that orgy of coverage at the 5th anniversary this year, 6 weeks ago, you know, all sorts of things were reassessed, fingers were pointed, you know, failures identified, and what was missing? Gee, I don't know. I didn't see very much of reassessment of press coverage, did you? I mean, you think about it. Do you remember hardly anyone talking about the media? Or how are we doing? Or let's revisit the run-up. What did we do wrong then? And what have we done wrong since? And, you know, it's almost as if we don't even have a media. It's like a state media that you can't criticize yourself. So I think that revealed the lack of the unwillingness to take responsibility for their sins of omission and commission on display right there. And I was shocked. I mean, it's not easy to shock me these days, anything related to the war, but it was kind of shocking to me that there was so little media self-assessment of their how they did. Again, quickly, another, you know, recent development or continuing development is that the people who are so wrong about the war continue to get rewarded, and the people who are right don't seem to get much out of it. Most recent case, Bill Kristol, who's been wrong about virtually everything, lands a spot on the New York Times op-ed page. So, you know, if he was much more wrong, maybe he'd get to be God or something. I don't know. It's just the more wrong you are, the more you get rewarded. So I have a whole list in the book going through all the people who were so wrong and so wrong for so long, and yet are still taken seriously, are still treated as respected pundits. And you know, you do get a little more criticism on TV now and in the press. There are a few more sort of anti-war voices, but it's still, you know, 90% the other direction, which brings me to the next topical topic, which is what I call the media generals. the recent scandal, which surfaced and then kind of disappeared, the so-called propaganda Pentagon plan, where they deployed these retired military officers who became spokesmen for the war in the run-up to the war and ever since, who were given talking points at the Pentagon, who were kicked out of the program if they got out of line, who were monitored, taxpayer money, hundreds of thousands of dollars paid to a company which monitored all the statements of these officers when they went on Fox and all the other networks to deliver the talking points. And as we've seen since this came out in the New York Times, virtually none of the networks have commented on it or they've defended it. Brian Williams defended the NBC recently, and the story has almost disappeared. And it's really one of the real media/Pentagon scandals of our time. You know, these are blatant taking people who are presented as experts who are being given talking points by the Pentagon, but it just, you know, it only made more blatant the fact that, particularly in the run-up to the war, there were very few anti-war voices on TV. You had 14 generals and maybe one person making a little peep in protest. So, so that's a current issue. We had just yesterday or 2 days ago, a subject near and dear to my heart, Michael Gordon of the New York Times, raising fears once again about Iran, beating the drum, without saying he's beating the drum, but every few months he comes up with a story, usually on the front page of the Times, about Iranian weapons in Iraq, about Iranian operatives in Iraq, or Iran working with Hezbollah. One of his sources, I have a column in the book, one of my favorite all-time names for sources, that Michael Jordan, boy, we'll call him Air Gordon. That he used, one of my great sources, Hamid the Mule was one of his sources for one of his columns. This is almost as good as Curveball, one of Judy Miller's sources. So you have this continuing drumbeat today, relevant to today, possible attacks on Iran. I think, to be fair, a lot in the media have learned a lesson. I think overall, mainstream media a little more critical of the drumbeat for war when it comes out, that Michael Gordon gets his front page story, and then others such as McClatchy and other papers come up with different stories. It's not as uniform as it used to be. So, I mean, to be fair, I think there are more questions raised in the same similar kind of push for an attack on whether it's Syria or Iran or whoever, but still not enough. And it's really, I suppose I should close with, you know, my overall thrust of the book, I suppose, is, you know, goes back to when I was in journalism school, and really kind of the first rule you're sort of taught, or used to be taught, was to be skeptical. Even if you become a reporter for a little tiny newspaper in Topeka, and you're just interviewing the local, garbage department official, you don't take what he says as gospel. You know, you check it out with other people. You see, maybe you get some documents or whatever. And that doesn't mean be critical, doesn't mean be negative, but skeptical. And yet, the greatest reporters in the country were not skeptical enough when Colin Powell spoke to the UN, when Dick Cheney talked about aluminum tubes, when President Bush linked Saddam to 9/11 or to WMDs. And these were the greatest reporters in the country. Some of them did a great job, but too many were not skeptical. So I think that's the way I will wrap this up. So we have time for questions. So, thank you for paying attention. It's fine.
Hello. Thank you for all the informative discussion. But the problem is everything you said is stuff that we already know. And we are here, we're uninformed and misinformed people. You're the informer of this group. Can you tell us the reason, the motivation why we invaded Iraq? I'm sure you have a couple of chapters over there, but you didn't mention about it. Maybe we can even take a poll, it's a small group, as to why we think we invaded Iraq. United States of America, across the oceans, invade another country. Why? And let's discuss, since we have a couple of minutes, as to what the reasons can be, which we never hear from the media.
Right.
Isn't that a smart, something that we should know before we decide or discuss whether we should get out of Iraq or when? Right.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, unfortunately, my book is really not about that subject. It's not a book that focuses on the why. It more raises questions of why, A, the media fell for the stated reason of WMD linked to Al-Qaeda and so forth, rather than looking at the time into what the other reasons might be, including just simply that it was, the Bush came to office determined to do this. So it wasn't even like he needed a reason. So anything I would say, I mean, anyone here might have an opinion just as good as mine. I'm not an expert on exactly why, and I'd be surprised if there's a simple answer. If someone just says it's all about oil, I would suggest that's probably not all about oil. It may be partly about oil. You might say it's all about Bush wanting to finish the job that his father didn't complete. Well, that may be part of it, but I don't think that's all of it. So what I do reject is the stated reasons, and I reject the notion that the media, it's often said that the media can be forgiven because, well, it was post 9/11 and patriotic fervor and et cetera, et cetera. Well, Afghanistan should have taken care of that. If you want to say we shouldn't have bombed Afghanistan the way we did or whatever, but patriotic fervor, payback, revenge, that's perfectly understandable. But Afghanistan should have taken care of that. So I don't accept the fact that the media naturally kept playing along with this just simply because of 9/11.
But it is an important, in addition to the numerous things that you've highlighted, a significant gap in corporate media coverage that there doesn't seem to be any, in addition to all the other many things you enumerated. There's no investigation of, okay, so this is not the reason. Right. What is the reason?
Right. Yeah. Oil is the reason for 1991.
Well, the latest thing today, which because I've been traveling, I haven't caught up with, but apparently all or the most important White House emails from the run-up to the war are found out to have been erased or something. They were the group that was petitioning for them through the period up to May 2003, and they got the tapes and they're all missing. So have to catch up on that.
What do you think about the suppression of certain things in which the media has nothing to lose, like Winter Soldier?
Winter Soldier? Yeah.
Anything about it, and
well, we covered it.
The only thing that's covered it is Democracy Now!
Right.
No one else has, and I don't think media has anything to lose directly from it, but still.
Well, that's a good point. That's a subject probably. I mean, we covered it at Little Editor and Publisher. But you have to be interested to start with, and the mainstream media would probably say, oh, it was a conference, we have so many things to cover, and there are all these other things going on, and we couldn't spare a reporter. And was it in Detroit, wherever it was held? Washington? Couldn't get it together. But that's I mean that is part and parcel of the whole lack of interest in the whole question of atrocities and civilian casualties and, digging too deeply into that. So, beyond that, it's, fortunately, I mean, editor and publisher is for the mainstream, or that's we came into being for the mainstream newspapers mainly. So it pains me to to sort of say that one of the reasons they've lost audience and continue to lose audience is that people like you feel they need to go to other sources, websites, blogs, foreign press, BBC, whatever your Democracy Now, whatever you get it, to get that information. And it's all the more, like I said, shocking to me when they would not own up to their shortcomings in the run-up, in the whole coverage of Iraq, because it's one of many reasons, but it's one reason that they are losing audience, particularly with younger people, because they feel they're not not telling it like it is or telling it often enough.
You gave us a very disturbing list of failures of the press in Iraq.
Right.
I'm hoping that you can tell us also something about why that happened. What are the mechanisms that decide what goes on the front page, what goes in the editorial?
Right.
It can't be that it's a collective blindness of the press. So, why?
Well, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, first of all, there's little evidence. Now, I don't know about Rupert Murdoch in some cases, and certainly we know at Fox News they do get talking points from Roger Ailes and other people. But in the main, it's not like a corporate, some big corporate person or Disney or GE or whoever, orders coverage of a certain type. Even writes a memo saying you've been too tough on this or something like that. It really is, it's like in any big company, certain people get hired, and then they perform in a certain way that could be expected based on the people you hire, and within parameters that are set. We saw the example that's mentioned in the book is that Phil Donahue at MSNBC was practically the only kind of war critic on network or cable news in the run-up to the war. And his bosses kept saying, well, it's fine, you can do that, but you've got to have, for every guest you have who's against the war, you have to have 2 or 3 who are pro-war. That was one case. A memo came out about it, and he eventually got canned, even though he had the top-rated show there. And he was, he was let go. But that was a rare case where there actually a memo surfaced where, one of his bosses was on his case. Usually it's not that direct. And people self. That's why the key factor is self-censorship, not that someone from above is giving you orders. So I think that's one factor. The other is just the echo chamber, whatever you want to call it, beltway thinking, particularly among pundits. People, your friends, your associates, it'd be embarrassing to imagine one of those pundits who said they thought Colin Powell was full of it, Emperor has no clothes, And they have to face their friends and others in the pundit class in Washington saying, what, have you lost your mind? Of course, everyone knows that Colin Powell wouldn't do that. So there's that kind of echo chamber that that has an effect. So it's partly human nature. It's partly people who have they have a limited view of the political spectrum. It sort of goes from near liberal to far right. It's sort of like you have this whole wide spectrum, and you kind of have near liberal and far right, and this is the thing, and then you got all these people out here who, the Amy Goodmans or whoever, who don't really make it on TV or mainstream TV. So.
Thank you. You answered part of my question. I have quite a few friends who are Neiman Fellows. I spent a lot of time at the Shorenstein Center over at the Kennedy School. I went to a wonderful panel discussion recently on awarding investigative journalists like Dana Priest, who
Yeah.
wrote about the other Walter Reed,
Right.
and Joshua Key, who wrote about veterans being misidentified as having personality disorders so that they would not be eligible for health benefits, and also they would have to pay back their signing bonuses, and all of these scandals. And it restored my faith. I have a great deal of contempt for a lot, as an American citizen, for the media, and I was lumping them all together. But now I know there are shining lights, although very few.
Right.
But my question to you, with the exception of Colbert at the 2006 White, when I look at the movie, like I wasn't born during Edward R. Murrow's time, but I watched the movie Good Night and Good Luck, and I see people comfortably sitting and having their foie gras and champagne with the very people they're supposed to report on. And how could you possibly be a critical if you don't have some, what do you call it? Distance, thank you. You know, emotional distance. Your kids aren't going to sit well friends along with them. You understand? So how can you possibly be a critical? As you said, you lose too much.
Right.
You're not the working class person now. You're of the privileged class, and you don't want to lose that. And as you said, you don't want to lose face if you have the audacity to speak your truth. And having seen, again, hearing General Shinseki, what had happened to him when he spoke up, looking at journalists who have been vilified and pushed away for having the moral authority to say this is wrong.
Right.
The cost was so high compared to giving up your condo and your home on the beach.
Right.
You know, my question is, how can I, as Americans, possibly have any faith?
Well, in a way, you're voting voting by getting your news from other sources. And that's the problem. Yeah, well, that's the problem. That's a problem for the mainstream media.
The reason why I bring this is because I met the director of BBC News, Helen Broden, over Harvard Business School, and I told her, I said, Madam, I want to thank you for your investigative journalism. I said, if I was an American citizen, exclusive of the internet, if I had to count on just the news, I would literally lose my mind. Because we're not seeing the coffins. We're not seeing so many things that Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, the BBC are showing, things that we need to know, things that are being said about us that we need to, it's not optional. And we're closing more and more foreign offices, and we're not knowing. So,
well, that's all true. The newspapers have consolidated, they're closing, as you mentioned, foreign bureaus. They're combining bureaus. There's far fewer people covering the world in general, whether it's Iraq or otherwise. It could just be something in Africa or whenever. So that's an overall problem. You also raise, I think you raised the question that people also, they don't want to lose their career or be looked down upon by the people they're covering. Earlier I had been talking about losing favor with their colleagues. So it's sort of two separate issues. One is losing face among their colleagues. The other is losing face with some of the people they cover, where they don't get the scoops or they don't get the leaks. Maybe it might be a good thing if they didn't get as many leaks. Because they're in the leak business, and so they curry favor with people, and then those people give them leaks which may be false. I'm glad that Dana Priest curries her leaks, but leaks come from good and bad sources. So, but one thing I didn't mention was the real depravity in the system. And a night that was simultaneously one of the black marks in the history of the presidency and one of the black marks in the history of the press was not at the Stephen Colbert White House Correspondents' Dinner, but 2 years before that at the radio, I think it's called Radio and TV Correspondents' Dinner, when President Bush, and this was already, the war had gone bad and there were dozens of U.S. soldiers dying every week, did a slideshow, in his little, comedy routine, and he stood in front of, the podium, and they were flashing slideshow up on the sort of reminiscent of his White House Christmas things with Barney and the dog and everything, and as he showed pictures of him looking under a desk, looking out the window, you know, looking in the bathroom, and his running text was, oh, no WMDs there. You know, where did those WMDs go, you know? Darn, you know, what happened to those WMDs? And he's looking under the table, and it's, you know, ha-ha. Made even worse by the press laughing along with it. And nary, my friend David Korn was practically the only one the next day who wrote something saying he was at the dinner, saying he was appalled by the, you know, the reaction of the press. Nobody saying, oh, or, you know, hissing maybe, or even just the next day writing a column saying, well, President Bush really went too far, and, you know. So that's, I have a chapter about that in the book. And so that's, you know, that's maybe combined several things there, including the press people sitting at a table with their colleagues who are afraid to, you know, show displeasure and want to laugh along with their colleagues. And then the whole room is laughing and so forth. So, over here.
Since you mentioned David Korn, it's a good entree. What people have mentioned Democracy Now! And blogs and internet, but what hasn't been mentioned are the smaller, not mainstream media like The Nation and Progressive and Mother Jones and so forth. I've subscribed to The Nation for decades, and I resonated with what you said a little bit ago about the spectrum is kind of from something liberal to right wing, but people consider something like The Nation to be just left wing. They're not objective, you know, as if mainstream media were objective. And I think, I mean, unfortunately, David Korn has left The Nation, right? But
well, he's at Mother Jones, so.
But Eric Alterman, I mean, there are a lot of really good people, and sometimes I just feel frustrated. I mean, that's where I go to find out what's really going on, but I suppose it's well, you know, hopeless to think of that becoming more.
Well, there is more. I mean, I mean, maybe it's inevitable, and I suppose I've become as bad as anyone else because I blog and I have an opinion column and everything else. But I think it's unfortunate that we're coming to a place where, as I mentioned earlier, everybody, or vast majority of people now get all their news from places they already agree with, and the same places, and they go to ideological places for their news and opinion, and you know, it's unfortunate. I'd rather have people who do, you know, at least go to the BBC, or you go around the internet, go to all sorts of places, valid news sources, and not just get their news from Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and so on and so forth. I think it's, you know, it's kind of tragic that it's you kind of have there's not so much dialogue going on. But I lost my train of thought on what the point I was building up to. You were, well, here's what I was going to say was, on the other hand, if you can see a little more vision of where more balance might be, if you look at often on WSNBC in the evenings, even in their election coverage, where now you have Keith Olbermann, who some people think is pretty liberal, and you have Rachel Maddow from Air America, who I know is very liberal, and Eugene Robinson, who is the black liberal columnist for the Washington Post, and then they put Pat Buchanan on there. So it's almost like a reverse of what we often see. We have a right-wing guy, and then you know, a couple sort of liberal and kind of a lefty person on the panel. And they mix in Joe Scarborough, and they mix in Katrina vanden Heuvel and so forth. So, you know, I think, you know, that is closer to a spectrum, particularly when you look at the war. I mean, when you have, you know, 66% of the American public who say the war was a mistake, it's not worth fighting, and we should get out. You don't see 2 out of 3 experts on TV, particularly if you factor in Fox into the total, who are against the war. You know, you're lucky if you get 50-50. And yet the American public in every poll is 2/3, it was a mistake, it's not worth loss of American life, we should get out. So it has a long way to go, and I'm not sure we're really going to get there.
Thanks. I have a couple of observations, but first of all, I first encountered your work, I think, some years ago via...
Oh, this could be scary.
No, no. Well, maybe, but I don't think so. Via Common Dreams, the website, which I think has been an important example of sort of internet-based alternative information that's been widely read. And so anyway, thank you for what you've been doing. A couple of observations. I sort of found myself wondering if a better title for the book might not have been Mission Accomplished, because I see the corporate media, and I call it corporate media, not mainstream media, as a transmission belt in many ways. Though they like to pretend they're sort of outside, actually they're part of the problem, and they're conveying the lies. They're the transmission belt for the lies and for the propaganda. And I am interested in the question of how this happens, and the sort of systemic, or, you know, the question that was asked earlier about how this happens. Why is it this way, and what, of course, what can be done about it? One simple thing might be, when you mentioned Phil Donahue's program, I mean, the sort of obvious thing is that NBC is actually part of a giant military contractor, conglomerate, GE Corporation, one of the biggest military weapons producers in the world. But I think obviously that maybe can be too easy for some of the corporate media. But there is this sort of corporate nexus. They're not sort of apart from it. They're part of corporate power in this country, and that raises a couple of, I mean, I've sort of gone to sleep on a lot of this stuff over the 5 years of...
Not tonight, I hope.
...psychic numbing. But the relationship between government regulation and the FCC and corporate media and campaign contributions and paying for television time for political advertising, that's an area that hasn't been touched on that I think is interesting. I also think that I love it when there's a bemoaning of the fact that people are tuning out. I think it's great that people are tuning out from corporate media and choosing to get their news from Jon Stewart from The Daily Show. I think it's a great program. I think it's more reliable. I think it's more entertaining. I think it's a pithier summary. I watch it whenever I can, and I enjoy hearing certain, not you, but some people say, oh, isn't it terrible young people are getting all their news from, you know, in the New York Times bending over backwards to call it fake news anytime they report about it. I get a laugh out of that. And another quick observation about Winter Soldier. I actually, this is sort of an aside, a guy I knew once, ambitious, wanted to have a career in journalism, ended up being a feature writer for the Washington Post, and I approached him about an effort that I was involved with once in Washington, D.C., and his response to me was, well, we don't feel obliged to cover every demonstration that happens in Washington. But more relevant is, I think the attitude that I've encountered, and that, well, these people are just trying to manipulate us. You know, Winter Soldier, would they have an agenda? But what's interesting to me is it's so easy for them to talk about the agenda that people who put on Winter Soldier have, but not the U.S. government, not the Bush administration. They're so courageous in fighting the manipulation by the left, or whoever they are, but they have no balls or gonads when it comes to the real power that's manipulating them, that they're part of on a daily basis. So I just wanted to share that insight as well.
Well, that's a lot to respond to. You know, like I said, I think obviously the corporate media is an important concept, and there's getting more and more attention, and looking at the FCC and everything. I do think that you know, the problem is lack of voices. I mean, I still would like to see more voices in the mainstream. I like to have millions of people, even like the Comedy Central. It's nice that a large number of people can watch that, as opposed to if they're on a public access station, you know. So I'm all for reaching as many people as possible, and you know, more diversity would be good. I think that all the points about corporate media, it's all true, but I think also, you know, they're out to make a buck. And for example, NBC is now pushing MSNBC as almost a liberal alternative to Fox. Oberman's ratings have doubled. They feel they're on the right path and getting more people. And not that it's left-wing now or will ever be left-wing, but I think, you know, they will, if they think they can carve out a niche there and make a buck off it, they're not going to hold back and say, well, you know, we're owned by GE or whatever. So you know, it's not a straight line, but the overall trend is, or the overall situation is, you have so few people. You have the interlocking directorates that you know, that control everything. I think the Nation every year, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to do an annual, you know, kind of family tree of, you know, who owns what, you know, and you can link all the things. There's not that many. You can trace back to this, you know, small universe. So I mean, that's what's scary. But and I think it's all true. But on the other hand, I think the way the media is set up and the fears that people have and the careerism and the echo chamber and everything else, you know, what has happened with Iraq, you know, it probably would have happened much the same way anywhere, you know, with these people. And it's the turning point is, as you said, so many people now getting their information in other places. You know, I'm all for people, you know, getting information in other places, but I'm enough of an old-time journalist to want to believe in facts and facts over opinion whenever possible, and get all the facts, and don't just get it because someone is telling you something, and don't become, you know, like the Rush Limbaugh's ditto heads, you know, and so I'm still a big believer in, you know, getting as many facts as you can. So.
The New York Times and the Washington Post are special interest in this whole discussion. What do you, I mean, in that, well, in
specific instances of the New York Times and the Washington Post,
right.
I have a suspicion that there's an agenda that is specific to those corporations, those institutions, that has to do with Israel. Is that misguided? I mean, I look for evidence for it. I think there's some. Do you think within the larger picture of the kind of critique that you and others, what do you make of those two important, extremely, you know, the two major newspapers of record and their role in, you know, endorsing the war? Yeah.
Well, I don't want to go too far out on a limb on those two papers specifically, but certainly the the influence of the Israeli lobby and the neocons and so forth is, tremendous influence that, has gotten so little attention in the media. And, of course, it goes back to America's, special relationship with Israel and so forth. But, you were asking earlier about the reasons for the war, the causes for the war, and so forth. And you get very little attention paid to this, except when you go back and look at the writings of the Richard Pearls and all these other people. You go back to the people who were in favor of the war, pushing the war, promoting the war, their own words, 6 years ago and 7 years ago. And so many of them were blatantly saying that it's, partly or largely because of Israel, making Israel safer and so forth. So you can make of that what you will. But there's no question that that's gotten less coverage than it deserves. And then people can make, they can say, well, it's not that big a factor or it's a tremendous factor, but it certainly hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. Over here.
This will be the final statement or question.
Well, I'm so glad that you came a little bit close to the motive, just like Scotland Yard does. When there's a crime, they look at the motive before they arrest somebody. And looking at the motive is going back in time. You go back. When did the cheerleaders, you tell, since you don't have an opinion about, or a chapter about the motive of why we invaded another country, maybe you can be the referee as to if this can be the motive. If these guys, 7 or 8 or 9, the cheerleaders and the supporters of the occupation between 92 and 96, they're cheerleaded for one reason only. In 97, they established PNAC, Project for a New American Century, which has the same office as American Enterprise Institute. And after 97, yes, it's WMD, oil, we're going to kick butt in other parts of the world. But between 92 and 96, consistently, those 8 or 9 individuals, they cheerleaded for the reason of occupying Iraq for one reason only, and majority of them, about 88 of them, were in the White House within 3 months of when Dick Cheney or George Bush came to power. Can you tell us this can be the motive, whatever that reason is?
Absolutely. That definitely is a motive. And I said you can go back to look at what these people, these very influential people, what they were promoting. You know, Wolfowitz himself said in Vanity Fair, he was quoted as saying, "Oh yeah, well WMD, that wasn't the real reason, but it was, you know, that was the only thing that would sell." Which is a very revealing comment. So you say, well, WMD, for these people, the WMD wasn't even the real reason. What was the real reason? So then you go back to some of these things. But again, I think it's interlocking. The same people who maybe were extremely concerned about Israel and were driven by their concern for Israel also were very, hated, the idea of, Saddam having influence or having survived the first Gulf War. They're still mad about that, and they want to get back at, strike a blow against Iran or whatever the motives were. So it's interlocking. It's not like they didn't have other motives as well.
No, they didn't have any. Between 92 and 96, they had only one reason why they published those research papers when he was in part of the Pentagon, Paul Wolfowitz, and Richard Pearl. But the thing is, there was no mention of oil. There was no mention of WMD. There was no hatred for Saddam's mustache. It was only for one reason.
Okay, I know.
I'm disappointed that you didn't reserve one chapter for that important thing.
Well, again, it's not the focus of the book, for one thing, and second, like I've said, I think there are interlocking motivations. It's just like there's interlocking motivations for why the media has acted the way they did, and I just don't like to reduce things to one simple answer because I think it's people have different motivations and it gets all mixed up in a lot of different things. But the bottom line is that every motivation you've talked about, including oil and all the other things, have not been explored enough by the media so that people have a better idea of what the real reasons were. I mean, to me, and I do make this point in the book, what always amazed me, and maybe you can point out the poor logic in this, but it always kind of amazed me that people were saying, well, we're going to war because of WMD, okay? And we're going to send 100,000 troops invading, heading for Baghdad, and because we think Saddam has WMD. Well, if he has WMD, if he's ever going to use them, he's going to use them when he's got 100,000 troops approaching Baghdad. And yet we send 100,000 troops into what should have been a massacre. But by all rights should have been, if Saddam had WMD and if he was as bad a guy as we said, should have been a massacre of just horrendous proportions and the most awful kind of deaths you can suffer from chemical biological weapons. And yet we did it without seemingly that much concern. So it struck me at the time, and I wrote about it at the time. Is there something wrong here? I mean, doesn't it seem like maybe we don't really believe? We think maybe there's a 1% chance that he has WMD because we don't really seem to think we're really risking 100,000 lives. So so that's the point I made. And now, but we can leave it to, leave it to you to, explore all the other reasons, all the possible reasons. But I certainly agree that WMD was never the point. Well, it looks like we're at the witching hour here.
Thank you, Greg.
So thank you for coming, and thank you for the good questions.